Who raised you more, your parents, your grandparents, or someone else?
Christmas Eve had the soft hiss of the furnace and the clink of heirloom plates and the brittle shine people paced over old arguments. And right in the middle of all that seasonal choreography, my dad set down his fork with the authority of a town judge everyone humors at parades and said, slow and even like he was reading from a warranty, that I was a burden and should leave this house. Which made my brother bite down on a rehearsed smirk and my mother study the gravy boat as if ceramic could offer counsel. While I felt a surprising steadiness unspool through my chest, the kind of calm you get when a doctor finally names the thing that has been chewing through your days in silence, and I heard myself say okay in a voice so flat it didn't even echo. Because I have learned that in our family timing beats volume, and if you want something to change you don't shout, you schedule. I cleared plates with the smile of a polite hostage and rinsed pans that have outlasted decades of apologies that never arrived, and when my mother hovered beside me tying and readying a trash bag like it might cinch shut the moment itself, she whispered that your father didn't mean it, though we both knew he always means it more when there is an audience, and I said as much without raising my tone, because I decided sometime between the green beans and the cranberry sauce that I would not give him the easy theater of my temper. I would give him arithmetic, which is colder, cleaner, and much harder to argue with after the music stops. By the time the last plastic container left in someone else's arms and the front door side shut, I had already taken stock of what mattered, my phone with a folder labeled if ever, the copies of repayment letters tucked in a sleeve behind my insurance card, the memory of where I had taped the routing number under the fish fry calendar, and the simple truth that for years I have been the quiet mechanism that kept this house sounding like stability, the autopay that hummed while everyone else performed normal. So I spread a blanket that smelled faintly of winter candles over the couch my brother calls his inventory overflow, and stared up at a ceiling stain shaped like Florida until my eyelids stung, then answered a text from Kelly, who is the only person I know who can make a bank feel like a vending machine, and I told her, yes, 5:59 alarm, 7 o'clock button, recorder on, because if you are going to choose precision over fireworks, you document. I drifted in and out while the house settled, counting humiliations like sheep, remembering the month my mother slid a mortgage notice under a pie tin and called it a favor. The week my father told a circle of church friends that my bookkeeping job was paper shuffling while he accepted their sympathy for the stress of keeping a roof over the family. The morning my brother borrowed my car and returned it perfumed with a cologne that smelled like debt and optimism, and in that inventory I found not anger exactly, but a balance sheet of respect unpaid, and I promised myself that when the alarm sounded I would not argue about feelings, I would adjust settings. The phone chimed at 5:59, polite and ruthless, and I stood in the cold kitchen where the tile always reminds you to be awake, set the coffee because habit has dignity even when the people don't, opened the folder where boredom becomes power, and confirmed what I had already arranged with 3 late-night emails and 2 identity verification calls, autopay canceled, third-party access revoked, ACH authorization withdrawn by the authorized remitter whose name is mine, and then I waited. Sipping from a mug I would still pour for my mother because she has always tried, even when trying looked like silence. At exactly 7 the furnace clicked like a metronome awarding me the downbeat, so I walked to the door of the bedroom my parents have shared since before the first refinance and knocked. And when my mother opened in her robe with the expression of a person bracing for weather, my father appeared behind her already in the pants he wears when he wants to feel like authority, and he asked if I had packed or needed help being efficient. And I said neither, then lifted my phone as neutrally as a notary and told them something simple, that at 7 I had stopped paying their mortgage and utilities, and for one measured breath the hallway held us like a photograph before my father laughed the laugh of a man who believes bills pay themselves out of respect. And he said I didn't pay anything here, they carried me, and I tapped the screen and tilted it so the morning light could kiss the lines that matter. The email from the servicer with the timestamp and the digital signature waited like a bailiff, and the subject line stated that effective immediately recurring payments were canceled at the request of the authorized remitter, my name spelled correctly for once. And when I added that the repayment plan my mother had signed with me after the pandemic witnessed by my father's initials, was also terminated. My mother put a hand to her throat the way she does at baptisms and bad news, while my brother leaned in to squint like skepticism could edit a bank's records, and my father, whose pride wakes earlier than his good sense, turned red at the edges and demanded to know what authorized remitter meant. And I said that it meant I had been the little motor behind their lights and their heat and the roof they told their friends they paid for, and that if a burden was what they saw when they looked at me, then I had decided to stop lifting what was never mine to carry while being insulted. 4. The weight. Decency, he said. What about decency at Christmas? And I nearly laughed, but swallowed it because I would like my future self to recognize me. So I answered that decency would have been not calling your daughter a burden over glazed ham. And then I took from my pocket a small manila envelope addressed to my mother, and handed it to her with the instruction to open it at noon if my father still believed the story he had just told, and when his hand shot out to snatch it, she held it to her chest with a strength that startled him into stillness, and I told them coffee was ready because kindness, when it's chosen, is sharper than any knife in the drawer, and I added that the next click in this house would not be the thermostat. I left them in that doorway made narrow by pride and walked back to the kitchen where I set 2 mugs beside 2 empty chairs and let Kelly's text buzz across my screen. How did it go? And I replied that phase 1 was complete and phase 2 would arrive at noon. Then reached to the side of the refrigerator and slid the folded routing number from beneath a cheerfully magnetic lighthouse, and as I tucked it into my pocket, I looked at the thermostat and at the calendar and at every quiet thing in this home that has obeyed me for years, and I felt the architecture of a life tilt a few degrees toward truth. When noon arrives, my mother will open the envelope and stare at the printed repayment agreement that bears her signature and my father's witness initials, a tidy little contract from 2 summers ago naming me the payer of record. But for now I let the kitchen clock walk there on its own legs, because timing beats volume, and at last I have found the volume knob. By mid-morning the house had settled into that uneasy quiet that follows a public scolding, a hush with edges, and while my mother rinsed cups like penance and my father stalked the hallway tugging at cabinet doors as if brass hinges might vote in his favor, I brewed another pot of coffee and set my phone face down because I did not want the small satisfaction of notifications to interrupt the larger ceremony of unveiling the simple, unglamorous truth that had been paying this roof's dignity for years. And when the clock on the stove rolled toward noon with the stubbornness of a town ordinance, I slid the manila envelope across the table to my mother and told her to open it, not because I enjoy theatrics, but because paperwork, when read aloud, sounds a lot like a mirror finally speaking. She cracked the seal with careful fingers and lifted out the first sheet, and the kitchen seemed to lean in as she traced the header with her eyes, recognizing the mortgage servicer's crest and the precise date from 2 summers ago. And then she found her own signature where she had signed a repayment agreement that put me, her daughter, who apparently qualified as a burden yesterday, as the payer of record for a forbearance ladder and an autopay authorization that had kept the bank from calling. At dinner time, and below her name sat my father's witness initials, tidy and disclaiming, the little shrug of a man who wanted the help without the memory of accepting it. And when she looked up at him, her face carried that particular grief reserved for moments when love and truth collide and neither will move aside for the other. My father said a word like nonsense and reached for bluster the way some men reach for a hat, yet bluster tripped over the dates and the amounts and the certified mail tracking numbers I had highlighted in yellow and duplicated in triplicate. Because the paper did not raise its voice or care about his pride, it simply stated that for month after month the money had left my account at 5 in the morning and landed neatly in the servicer's ledger, that utilities in my name at their address had been paid before penalties sprouted, that when the water company tried to shut off the meter last winter some anonymous caller extended a hardship plan with a debit card that sounded suspiciously like mine, and that the anonymous caller was not a ghost, but a daughter who kept receipts because she learned a long time ago that feelings rarely hold in court. Noah, who prefers commentary to contribution, started in with the podcast tone about family being family and not nickel-and-diming holiday spirit. So I laid out the January emails the bank had sent me after a review flagged repeated third-party calls from this very kitchen, and the April note where my mother, overwhelmed and exhausted and trying to be the bridge everyone walked across without ever looking down, wrote that she trusted me to steer us through one more season and the August. Screenshot of the thermostat app that showed the setting raised and lowered from my phone when Dad declared the house too warm or too cold and then forgot who had hands on the dial. And the September PDF with the gas company's promise to waive a reconnection fee if payment arrived before the 1st, which it did because I set it to arrive before the 1st. Not through magic, but because I woke early on the 1st of every month and liked waking to solvable problems. He said I was punishing him for one sentence, as if a single sentence could carry no weight even when it sits on top of years of little digs and borrowed cars and borrowed credibility. And I said I was correcting a ledger, that I had not invented the numbers or the signatures or the rules that make contracts more durable than apologies, and that if he wanted to keep believing a story where his authority paid for what his authority could not possibly have covered, he could keep believing it. Without my bank riding shotgun, because being told you are a burden by someone standing on the platform you built is not a misunderstanding, it is a blueprint for extinction. At precisely noon my mother's hands trembled and fell to her lap, and then rose again with a decision, and she said in that small, steel voice she saves for hospital waiting rooms that the paper was true and that pretending otherwise would not make the mortgage blink. And my father opened his mouth to argue with his own initials until the oven timer, which no one had set, chirped once like a referee, and I took that as permission to move from revelation to remedy, because each act of exposure should be paired with an act of design if you want the lesson to stick longer than the echo. I opened my laptop, the one he calls the paper shuffler, and in front of them I clicked through the stack of practical levers no one notices until they stop moving. Removal of my third-party authorization at the servicer, revocation of access on the thermostat account, cancellation of the bundled streaming services that had been quietly siphoning out of my card while my father held court about how television used to be free, porting my mother's phone line to a separate prepaid account I funded for 90 days because she still calls her sister every evening and I am not cruel, and finally, after checking the small print twice, the hard stop on the household bank's overdraft protection that had labeled my money with their names so frequently the app thought we were married, and while I worked my father sputtered about decency and optics and neighbors. And I replied that decency is a two-lane road and I had been driving both directions for far too long. When the changes settled and the confirmations stacked in my inbox like dominoes with polite subject lines, I performed a last, small piece of revenge that felt less like a strike and more like removing a prop from a stage that never fit the play. Because I logged into the family phone plan, which has lived under my umbrella since the year my father's overtime dried up, and I migrated my mother to that safe island I had created for her while I let my father's line and Noah's line remain where they were, scheduled to suspend at 4 in the afternoon when the system cycles, which meant the next time he tried to rally a friend to complain about ungrateful daughters, or the next time Noah attempted to finesse a sale with his signature optimism, they would both meet a dial tone and a prompt that sounded a lot like accountability. The kettle hissed, a neighbor's snowblower coughed awake, the clock on the fridge ticked with cheerful neutrality, and my phone, face down again because I wanted the sound without the distraction, buzzed with a message that arrived like the world clearing its throat. It was from the church treasurer, a woman who handles compassion with spreadsheets, asking why the utility bill reimbursement had bounced this morning and whether the benevolence envelope my mother submitted last week should be redirected. And while my mother's eyes leapt to mine and my father's jaw set itself like a locked gate, I let the message sit there humming between us, because some truths deserve to arrive in plural. The next morning arrived without apology, the light cutting through the blinds in that dull, winter gray way that makes everything look like an unpaid bill, and I found myself at the kitchen table surrounded by the wreckage of old certainties. My mother stirring coffee she wouldn't drink, and my father pacing as if motion itself could change jurisdiction, while the silence between us grew thick enough to draft its own deposition. I had spent most of the night sifting through digital paper trails, confirming every link in the chain that held their comfort together, from mortgage statements archived on the bank's portal to utility accounts set to auto-renew through my debit card. And as the sun began to climb, I realized that revenge, when built properly, feels less like fire and more like math. It doesn't burn, it balances. By mid-morning, I was sitting across from Kelly at her desk in the downtown branch, where the air always smells faintly of printer ink and cautious ambition. She wore the same blazer she'd had since her promotion, and the same expression that told me she didn't need gossip. She already knew enough. "You sure you want to do this?" she asked, her fingers hovering above the keyboard like she was about to type a confession. I told her that I wasn't starting a war, I was filing an audit. The truth didn't need a lawyer, it just needed documentation. So we went line by line through every automatic transfer, every shared account, every authorization where my father's name had never appeared, and I signed the forms to terminate access like a surgeon cutting away dead tissue. Kelly slid a stack of disclosures across the table and said, "They're going to notice fast." I told her I was counting on it. She chuckled, half admiration, half concern, then lowered her voice as though the walls might tell. "You know, you could have just moved out." I smiled because she didn't understand that leaving quietly had been my role for 30 years, and this meticulous, paper-clipped rebellion was the first time I'd ever stayed in the room long enough to finish the sentence. When I stepped back into the cold, the street seemed sharper, cleaner. Snow gathered along the curbs in neat piles, the kind of order I envied. I walked past the bakery where my mother used to buy birthday cakes on credit and thought about how many celebrations had been funded by silence, how many kindnesses had come stamped with interest. Every adult child of proud parents learns that love and leverage sometimes share the same routing number. By the time I reached home, the house had developed a pulse of its own, uneven, defensive, alive with the hum of two people discovering just how much they never noticed. The television blinked error codes where subscriptions had been revoked. The thermostat blinked disconnected. My father sat in his chair, the same one he'd called his throne since retirement, scrolling through his phone with growing disbelief as automated alerts piled up, all addressed to him but linked to me. "Did you do this?" he demanded, waving the screen like proof of his persecution. "No," I said evenly, "I just stopped pretending I didn't." He started pacing again, muttering about betrayal and decency, those two currencies he liked to spend but never earn. My mother sat quietly, her face pale and damp with guilt that wasn't entirely hers. She tried to remind him that I had carried the load during the years when he'd been between opportunities, but he swatted her words away like flies. "It was family," he said. "Family helps each other." I turned toward him and asked if that generosity had an expiration date, because I distinctly remembered him shouting that I was a burden less than 48 hours ago. His face twitched, pride and panic wrestling for control, and then, as always, he pivoted to nostalgia, painting himself as a provider from some vanished era when men's word meant something. I let him finish the monologue. Every dictator deserves his broadcast before the power goes out. After lunch, I opened my laptop again and composed one final email, not angry, not pleading, just factual, addressed to the mortgage servicer, the utility providers, and the family's accountant. The subject line read, "Termination of third-party authorization, Morales residence." In the body, I wrote, "Effective immediately, I withdraw consent for recurring withdrawals and for account communications under my name. All future responsibilities revert to the legal occupants, Frank and Rena Morales." I attached the relevant documents, clicked send, and watched the progress bar crawl forward like an executioner walking to work. There was a strange serenity in that moment, as if the house itself exhaled. Evening crept in early, as it does in winter, swallowing the yard in gray, and when the furnace failed to click on, I knew the first bill had already reached its destination. My father stomped around flipping switches, cursing the air for not cooperating, while my mother wrapped herself in a blanket and tried to defuse him with words that dissolved before they reached his ears. I could have stepped in, Could have fixed it with a few keystrokes, but the whole point of an education, financial or emotional, is learning when to stop solving other people's lessons. So I watched instead, from the doorway, as he discovered that the warmth he had taken for granted didn't come from walls or wiring, but from someone who had been dismissed as a burden. Later, when the arguments had burned down to low embers, I sat alone in the living room and reviewed the day's messages. There was one from Kelly, all processed. They're officially on their own. Another from the church treasurer, confused about payment status, call me. I closed them both and stared at the window where my reflection looked steadier than I felt. I wasn't cruel, I told myself, I was accurate. And sometimes accuracy looks like revenge when viewed from the wrong side of the ledger. Upstairs, drawers slammed and voices rose again, but I stayed where I was, letting the rhythm of their panic roll through the floorboards. Somewhere in the distance, the neighborhood generator kicked on, a low mechanical growl that made the house tremble just enough to feel mortal, and for the first time in years, I understood that power isn't something you hold, it's something you stop giving away. By the third morning, the house no longer pretended to be a sanctuary and instead revealed itself as a collection of habits that had mistaken me for infrastructure, because the coffee brewed, because I said it. The bills cleared because I woke before dawn to herd them through portals that never thanked me, and the heat hummed because I carried the balance like a second spine, and now that those invisible levers no longer moved under my fingers, the rooms acquired a strange honesty. A draft around the outlets we had ignored, a thin chill in the hallway that belonged to December and not to me, while my father performed his favorite choreography of authority, drawer slam, thermostat jab, door stomp, as if momentum could generate a budget, and my mother followed him with a blanket and a litany of soft requests that might have worked when the counters were covered in casseroles and not overdue notices. I watched the frost on the inside of the window bloom in fern patterns and thought about how quickly certainty evaporates when its patron resigns, then pulled on my coat and walked to the grocery store, not because anyone had asked me to buy anything, but because sometimes the most strategic revenge is also logistically necessary, and I wanted milk that had not been watered down by guilt and bread that was not paid for with unspoken apologies, and on my way past the bulletin board where the church posted the dates for the coat drive and the blood drive and the concert by the handbell choir, I noticed a flyer that announced a workshop on financial literacy for adults, a thing that should be boring and is actually a parachute. And I took a photo not as a dig at my father, but as a future I might still want for my mother if she ever decides that survival does not have to be theatrical. When I returned, Noah sat in my spot at the kitchen table with the expression of a man imagining himself generous, his hands steepled over a notebook he clearly hoped would pass for a plan. And he opened with a speech about family unity and strategic pivots and the way his latest venture would absolutely explode once he closed a handful of key clients, which was his way of telling me that he wanted a bridge loan without the nuisance of interest or accountability, and when I asked whether he had paid back the last bridge loan or even drafted the bridge, he pivoted to charm, calling me irreplaceable and brilliant and a wizard with numbers, which, while flattering, did not address the frost inside the windows or the 2 emails that had arrived while I was in the cereal aisle. One from the mortgage servicer, whose subject line used the words delinquent and immediate, and another from the utility that supplies heat reminding us that grace has arithmetic. I told him I would help if my father acknowledged in writing who had kept the house standing and for how long, because I am not allergic to mercy, but I require an invoice, and Noah laughed in that light way people laugh when they think everything is negotiable, and said that Dad would never sign something like that because fathers do not confess to their children, and I said then fathers lose the luxury of warmth provided by those children, and his grin faltered, and he said I was making this personal when it should be practical, and I countered that the practice of pretending I had not underwritten their lives while they called me ballast was as personal as it gets, and if we were moving forward we were moving with signatures, dates, names, and a spelling of mine that did not autocorrect to martyrdom. By early afternoon the house was full of the restless sounds of people who have never had to wrestle with institutions on a deadline. And my father was on the phone with the bank asking to speak to a manager, and then a manager's manager, and then anyone who would tell him the account could simply overlook today because of his history. While I stood within earshot and heard the weary professionalism of a customer service rep explain that history is a story you tell yourself while the system counts days, and my mother refolded towels that were already folded and then unfolded them again because her hands needed a job, and I tried to imagine a version of this family in which my father did not equate apology with extinction, and the effort felt like pushing a car through snow in dress shoes. When the doorbell rang, it did not sound like a visitor or a neighbor or a delivery. It sounded like punctuation, a firm comma in a run-on of evasions. And when I opened the door, a man with a tidy clipboard and a coat that looked too thin for the weather asked for my father by full legal name and handed me a packet with a little nod that suggested he had done this before and would do it again. And my father appeared in the doorway with the suspicion of someone who expects bad news but still believes he is immune to it. And when I passed him the packet, his hands shook the way they do after too much coffee and too little humility, and he peeled back the corner, recognized the logo from the mortgage servicer, and went pale in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature, while my mother whispered his name as if breath alone could undo paper. He looked up at me with the fury of a man who has always believed consequences require consent, and said this would ruin Christmas and perhaps the whole neighborhood. And I said Christmas was already ruined when he called his daughter a burden and told her to leave the house she had kept from foreclosure, and that the neighborhood would survive because neighbors know the sound of truth even when households do not. And he opened his mouth and then closed it as if the words themselves were too expensive, and I turned away because I had no interest in starring in his redemption arc if he refused to write the first line himself. My phone buzzed on the counter with a message from the church treasurer asking gently to confirm whether the benevolence envelope should be voided and whether there was a better contact for future conversations about utilities. And as I read it, my brother asked again for that bridge loan, dropping his voice and promising to pay back every cent by spring, and the part of me that still wants to fix everything took one desperate step forward before the part of me that has finally learned to charge interest pulled it back, and I said that the bridge was available on one condition only, that my father put in ink that I was not a burden, but the bill payer of record for the years he prefers to attribute to grit and providence. And while Noah rolled his eyes and my mother pressed the back of her hand to her mouth, the front door opened to the wind, the process server's footsteps retreated down the walkway, and the house inhaled a draft that felt like a verdict I was finally willing to sign. The fourth night after Christmas arrived without ceremony, and for the first time in years I didn't hear the hum of the furnace that had always marked safety. That low mechanical reassurance that meant the bills were paid and the world outside could remain cold without consequence. Instead, there was only the faint rustle of curtains moving in drafts that no longer respected hierarchy. My father sat in his chair, shoulders curved inward like parentheses enclosing all his excuses, staring at the notice from the bank that had arrived that morning. My mother had folded it and unfolded it so many times the crease now looked like an incision. She whispered prayers under her breath, though whether for warmth or forgiveness, I couldn't tell. I stood by the window watching our neighbors' houses glow, steady, oblivious squares of light, while ours flickered as if unsure whether to keep pretending. The silence between the three of us had become its own language. It said everything that words could only dilute. My father, who once loved the sound of his own authority, now found that speeches didn't keep the lights on. He asked, in a voice that had shrunk to something brittle, what I planned to do now that I'd made my point. I wanted to tell him that points were for arguments, and this had never been one. This was arithmetic, the sum of years I'd kept us all from sinking while being told I was dead weight. But instead I said nothing, because victory, when real, doesn't need narration. At noon, my brother arrived carrying the kind of false cheer that sounds rehearsed in the car on the way over. He hugged my mother and avoided my eyes, then slipped into a conversation with my father about fixing this, as though the problem were mechanical, a switch someone could flip back to comfort. Their whispers turned to raised tones, and soon my father's old bluster returned in fragments, like a broken record rediscovering its chorus. We can still save the house, he insisted, if we just convince her to resume payments. He looked at me not with gratitude but expectation, the same expression he used to wear when asking for coffee. I told him that the servicer had already removed my name from every document and that any future correspondence would go to the rightful owners. The word rightful lingered in the air, heavy and sharp, because even he knew ownership is not about names on deeds, but about who shoulders the weight when everyone else hides. My mother began to cry softly, the sound almost polite, as if even her sorrow had manners. She asked me to reconsider, not for his sake, but for hers. I told her I already had. I had considered it every month when I transferred money I could have used to start my own life, every time I canceled a trip or delayed a medical appointment because someone else's due date screamed louder than mine. My father said I was cruel, that I had humiliated him in his own home. The words didn't sting this time. They simply proved he hadn't learned that humiliation is just honesty someone wasn't ready for. I told him that what I had done was not cruelty but exposure, that truth has a tendency to burn when it's been buried too long. He looked away, and in that moment I saw something that startled me, not rage, not even shame, but fear. Real fear. Not of losing the house, but of living without the illusion that he had been its protector. Later that evening, I called Kelly one last time. She told me the paperwork for the trust was ready, the one that would transfer the remaining balance of my savings into an account solely in my mother's name. I gave my confirmation without hesitation. The money wasn't enough to buy back the house, but it would buy her time, and time, when stripped of dependency, becomes its own kind of shelter. Kelly asked if I wanted my name on it as joint trustee, and I said no. I wanted it to be hers, untraceable to me, uncorrupted by gratitude or guilt. When I hung up, I packed the small suitcase I had kept under my bed since the pandemic, back when I used to fantasize about leaving for reasons that had nothing to do with punishment. My mother came to the doorway, eyes swollen, voice small. She didn't ask me to stay, and I loved her for that. She only asked where I'd go. I told her I didn't know yet, but that wherever it was, it would be mine in a way this house had never been. She nodded once, then reached for my hand. Her palm was cold, fragile as an unpaid promise, but she held on until my father's voice rose again from the living room, calling her name like an order he no longer had the power to enforce. I walked outside into the brittle evening air. The sky was the color of bank paper, that dull institutional gray that eats light. Behind me, the house stood silent except for the faint hum of appliances running on borrowed time. I thought about how much of our family had been built on the illusion of permanence, on the idea that as long as we gathered under one roof, the fractures didn't matter. But permanence, I had learned, isn't built from love or fear, it's built from accountability, and we had run out of that long ago. When I reached the end of the driveway, my phone buzzed with a message from Kelly. Transfer completed. She's protected. I stared at the screen for a long time before putting it away. My father's silhouette appeared briefly in the window, rigid and bewildered, and for a second I almost felt pity. Almost. Then I remembered every winter morning spent quietly fixing what he broke, every whispered insult disguised as discipline, every debt he had called love. As I turned down the street, snow began to fall in slow, deliberate flakes that refused to rush the ending. Each one landed softly, erasing footprints before they could freeze. I didn't look back. Houses are just bodies made of wood and brick. They collapse when the heart inside stops beating. This one had stopped long before the payments did. And yet, somewhere behind me, my mother would find the letter I had left on the kitchen counter, the one that ended with only one line: "The house can go, but the truth stays."